Dear participants, welcome to the third module of first week. In the previous module, we had discussed the basic definitions of proxemics, what are the different zones, namely the 4 zones of intimate, social, personal and public distances. We had also looked at the cultural connotations of these zones. In today's discussion, we would look at how cultures can be differentiated on the basis of being contact and non-contact, how context is important in certain cultures, whereas in certain it is not, and also we would look at different types of space understanding. As we have discussed in the previous module, proxemics is a way through which we look at the distances we unconsciously and sometimes consciously also maintain between ourselves and the other people in order to assess the emotions and ideas which are communicated. However, we find that it is not only the structuring of the macro space, but it is also the structuring of the micro space which is important to understand the principle behind proxemics. Hall has very rightly commented that this is the distance between men in conduct of their daily transactions, and further he says that it is also the organizations of space in his houses, buildings and ultimately the layout of his town. So, we find that proxemics does not only looks at the distances which people maintain between and amongst themselves in dyadic and team situations, but it also looks at how different aspects related with space and its arrangements are significant in communication of certain messages. At the same time, we find that proxemics also identifies the ways in which people bank on their cultural background to suggest how a particular spacing can pass on feelings and emotions related with their confidence. How much distance can create annoyance amongst people, whereas Hall's distribution of 4 zones sometimes has been commented on, if not actually criticized. His basic supposition that proxemic behavior is also dependent on the cultural aspects has never been questioned so far. And it is this aspect of cultural associations which we will discuss in detail. Hall has commented that cultures can be grouped in 2 ways. He has talked about contact and non-contact cultures in his book The Silent Language, which was published in 1959. His idea of contact culture is to denote those cultures in which close interpersonal distances are maintained, and at the same time those distances in which personal and individual touch can be promoted. On the basis of his studies, he has suggested that countries of Southern Europe as well as Arabic countries can be termed as being contact cultures, because in these societies normally he found that people are prone to touching each other, and at the same time they maintain closer interpersonal contact in dyadic and team situations. In comparison to others, he has put certain countries under his division of non-contact culture. He has commented on the basis of his researches again that Northern European countries as well as in Northern America, people exhibit opposite preferences and behaviors and prefer to maintain well defined and relatively more distance in their interpersonal situations. It can also be commented in passing that Hall's distinction of 4 zones of proxemic distances was also deeply inspired by a study by Heini Hediger, who is also known as the father of zoo biology. He was a Swiss ethologist and he had systematically observed the distances which different species of animals maintained in their behavior in contact with each other. He has named these distances as flight, critical, personal and social distances, and Hall had drawn a lot in his study on the 4 zones which human beings maintain with each other. However, the aspect of cultural dimensions of proxemic behavior is something which can be credited only to him. Another aspect towards which Hall has drawn our attention is of high and low context cultures. By the idea of context, he wants to suggest that in order to understand the behavior of a person, it is necessary to encode the whole situation or background of the given information. Sometimes it is reflected in the phrases which we use in our day-to-day speech, and at the same time it is also reflected in the proximity and distance which we maintain with each other. He had suggested that in high context cultures, communication is highly symbolic, and people are aware of so many unsaid things which remain in the background but which do affect the way in which our meaning is interpreted or has to be decoded by others. For example, the social hierarchy, the social status, and at the same time certain ironical linguistic behavior which compel that we maintain a certain way of distance and certain way of communication. In Hall's studies, he has commented that Japan as well as several Asian societies and certain Western countries are also under this group of symbolic cultures. He has quoted a very interesting example from the vocabulary which a British person can normally use. A British may comment, "I hear what you say," or may also say, "Oh, I almost agree." A person who does not belong to the high context culture may often interpret it as a confirmation of the statement which he has been trying to make. However, he would not be able to understand the ironical denial which is inbuilt in the high context culture. On the other hand, we find that the low context culture believes in a precise communication. In low context culture, a single information has only a single meaning, and the way an information is to be decoded is not to be influenced by the rest of the unsaid things which have gone into the background. We can also say that communication in low context culture is rule oriented, it is also better codified, and since it is better codified and rule oriented, knowledge can be easily transferable in such low context culture. And the examples which Hall has put across is that of the USA and Germany. At the same time, we find that whether a person is mindful of the context or not also depends on the social positions. And as we had seen in our earlier discussions, a single aspect of non-verbal communication cannot be taken up as being the final meaning. However, it is a very positive indication. Hall has also suggested that these characteristics of high and low context cultures are also reflected in his space arrangements, and nowadays very recent researchers have found that these tendencies are reflected not only in space arrangements, architecture and interior designing, they are also reflected in the designing of the web pages in different cultures as well as in our understanding of time. Whether the time we keep in our communication is monochrome or polychrome, or whether during our dialogues and conversations we are using different aspects related with our understanding of time. So, in a way we can say that the proxemic understanding has an overreaching significance in our today's communicative behavior. To continue this argument further, we can say that a high context communication is normally polite and respectful. It maintains certain proxemic distance, but at the same time it is never direct, and therefore it integrates by similarity and harmony, etc. It is also critical of the low context communication because it believes that it is impolite and it does not have the ability to read between the lines, and therefore it is rather naive or maybe too fast. In the same way, we find that low context communication is believed to be open and true. It is suggested that it is integrated with a certain directness and therefore it has a certain authenticity also. It therefore also claims that high context communication normally hides information, it is arrogant and therefore it cannot be trusted easily, it is too formal, too slow, etc. This diagram suggests how the significance of low and high context culture is important for us to understand in any intercultural situations. It is very important to understand the context, the cultural context in which a person is speaking to find out what exactly are the connotations of given information or to understand the ways in which the given information has to be decoded. It also provides us insight into different possibilities at the workplace in order to share information properly and at the same time to judge what are the expectations of different people from leadership role. We can say that each approach has its own strength. This particular video, which you can check later on, provides a very interesting commentary on the differences between the high context and low context cultures.
What is high and low context culture?
What is a low context culture? In a low context culture, it's more common for people to be direct, say what they mean, and could be considered more informative because of these points.
What is high context culture? High context culture is based on long-term relationships. High context is formal and implies meaning, and you have to look at the body language.
Some examples of high and low context culture.
Here's an example of low versus high context culture. French people can feel that Germans insult their intelligence by explaining the obvious, while Germans can feel that the French managers don't provide any direction.
Here's an example of a high context culture. In Chinese culture, it's common for the hostess at a dinner party to serve the guests less food. It is seen as a compliment for the guest to ask for more. This also prevents the guest from losing face if he doesn't like the food.
Here is an example of a low context culture.
Because of my personal effort, the business is doing better than ever.
Business culture.
Hierarchy is important in high context cultures. This is less so in low context cultures. For example, Chinese people really care for status. This is what determines if you deserve their respect. In a low context culture like Germany, they don't care about you and your status. If you work hard and efficiently, they respect you. A supervisor in a German business doesn't have a higher status than his employees just because his position is higher. If you work hard, your supervisor will treat you as equal.
With this background, now we come to a discussion of cultural differences in special connotations. We have already looked at the four basic zones of distances, that's intimate, personal, social and public. These zones are practiced in all cultures, but the space which is attributed to these different distances in different cultures is different. David Matsumoto has quoted several studies in this context. He has quoted a 1966 study of Watson and Graves, in which it was found that Arab males tend to sit closer to each other in comparison to American males. At the same time, Arab males were seen with a direct and confrontational types of body orientation. They also had a greater eye contact and were using louder voice. Another study which he has quoted is the 1968 study by Falston and Larson, in which it was found that the Latin Americans tend to interact more closely than students from European background. This study was conducted in academic university background. He has also quoted a study by Norse-Johan which was conducted in 1977 and 78 and which had found that Italians interact more closely in comparison to either Germans or American. Another study which David Matsumoto has quoted is the 1976 study by Schutter, in which he had said that Colombians interacted at closer distances than Costa Ricans. These special connotations alert us to the possibility of cultural differences which are inbuilt in our psyche. This diagram also helps us to understand how different cultures understand and interpret the sense of space in their interpersonal dealings. Another aspect which is significant for us to understand in the context of proxemics is how it is affected by our understanding of gender, and at the same time how does our understanding of social hierarchy influences our understanding of proximity. Space is always influenced by our understanding of how a particular gender code has to be enacted in a society, and also what is the role of power relationships within and outside different gendered relationships. We have seen how contact cultures use small interaction distances, whereas non-contact cultures avoid these close interpersonal distances as well as the frequent touching of each other. These cultural practices in fact are the culture codes which human beings learn at a very early stage of their life. Different researchers have told us that by the time a child is 3 years old, the child has imbibed these social codes. So, these social and cultural codes which define our understanding of distance, and at the same time which define our understanding of a proper gendered behavior, quote unquote, are learnt at a very early and impressionable age, so that they become almost a permanent part of our psyche. Context helps us in internalizing the messages which are passed on regarding the requirements of space and distances for functional purposes in our day-to-day and work life. Since different societies in our world today have different gender norms, these gender norms are not necessarily symmetrical, and therefore we find that different types of cultures have different designated spaces for different genders. This idea is known as genderization of space or space genderization. Particularly in conventional cultures, when the gender appropriate behavior is highly different for people belonging to different genders, this idea becomes important for us. It is seen that depending on the genders, people interpret the space and its intervention by people belonging to different genders in different manners. Certain researchers have found out that Hispanics, followed by Europeans or people of Caucasian origin, are least likely to feel that women are invading their personal space. So, they do not feel bad or threatened if women are coming into their personal space. On the other hand, people of the Middle East, as well as in terms of intensity, they are followed by Africans, who are the most likely to feel when women invade their personal space. This can be found in other aspects of our understanding of space. Since cultures have different models of behavior as far as different genders are concerned, it plays a very important part in our understanding of how a space is to be used. The understanding of proxemics by a man in any cross-gender situation is likely to be different in different cultures in comparison to how a woman understands it. In certain cultures, we find that women are likely to be more sensitive in those social situations when they have to interact in any cross-gender situation, and therefore they try to avoid what they perceive to be an invasion of their personal space by men. Generally, it can be said that closer proximity during dyadic interactions conveys a higher dominance, and in several cultures we find that this role of higher dominance is normally referred to the male psychological characteristics, and therefore such stereotypes are especially strong in such cultures. The idea behind all this discussion is that our understanding of space, how do we negotiate it in our interpersonal interaction with other people, is guided by our understanding of gender roles in a particular culture. Our sensitivity to these differences, which may be cultural as well as individual, because in the same culture we find that individual behaviors may also be different. So, this sensitivity to these differences would make us more observant of the behavior of other people and would turn us into a more effective person in our communication, because it would enable us to have a better empathy. Another precaution which we have to take during our understanding of the proxemic behavior is that these cultural differences should never be turned into cultural stereotypes to look down upon any cultural norm. Another aspect which is significant for us to understand in the context of proxemics is the different dimensions which initially Hall had talked about. According to Hall, proxemic behavior is a function of 8 different dimensions. He had developed these different dimensions basically as a system of notation, so that these dimensions can be recorded for research purposes on appropriate scales. This system also enabled the researchers to keep meticulous observations. The first dimension which he has referred to is the postural sex identifier, which is related with the postures which people take according to their gender. In our understanding of the postural sex identifier, the role of the culture is important. The second dimension he has talked about is the SFP axis, or the sociofugal or sociopetal orientation. It is also culturally coded and it is also linked with our age, gender, status as well as the social situation. Sociofugal describes those space arrangements that push people apart, away from each other, and sociopetal space arrangements are those arrangements which are based on those patterns which pull people together. The third dimension he has talked about is related with the kinesthetic factors. It looks at the positioning of body parts and different ways in which these body parts can touch each other. He has illustrated 4 ways and different body parts can touch each other. After that, he talks about the touch code, that is the amount of touch which is permissible during each interaction. How do people touch? How much frequently they touch each other? Whether this touch is accidental or is it prolonged? Is it caressing or is it holding? Whether people accept these touches conveniently or do they feel uncomfortable. So, the amount and frequency of touching each other in public is conditioned by our cultural understanding, and at the same time which body part is being touched upon is also decided by our cultural understanding. As we shall see in our further discussions, particularly our discussions of haptics, we would look at how in certain cultures touching overhead is considered to be inauspicious. The fifth dimension he has talked about is that of retinal combination, that is the amount of eye contact as well as the nature of eye contact, whether it is sharp, clear, peripheral, or whether there is an avoidance. As we shall see, it is also based with our cultural understanding, our gender differences as well as the power hierarchies within any organization. Then he also talks about the thermal and the olfaction codes. Thermal code is related with the amount of body heat which people perceive in each other, and it can function only when we are very closely positioned with each other. Olfactory codes are basically related with the interpretation as well as the messages which we want to convey with the help of our odor, the smell which we wear on our body, etc. Again, we shall discuss how in certain cultures it is preferable and how in certain cultures it is to be avoided. The last dimension he has talked about is related with the loudness of voice, which is conditioned by the distance, the relationship, the subject under discussion, as well as the culture and several other factors. These systems and dimensions are biobasic and they are rooted in physiology of the organism. It is not necessary that in our understanding of the proxemic behavior, all these 8 factors are equally important. And at the same time, not all these factors share the same level of complexity. For example, our understanding of the vision is much more complex in comparison to our understanding of thermal and olfaction inputs. After having discussed these dimensions, he also says that there is what can be termed as a cultural universal understanding of the 4 basic zones of distances. However, specific behavioral responses to these zones are defined according to our culturally specific conventions. So, again we find that Hall has repeatedly highlighted the significance of cultural understanding of proximity. Another aspect which is deeply related with our understanding of proxemics is how we create and use the built space around us, which is also a reflection of our subconscious understanding of proxemics. Many of us may not be aware that the norms of proxemic behavior govern our cultural understanding, but we become acutely conscious of these norms whenever there is a suggested violation or when we visit a foreign land where the arrangement of space is very different from what we had been used to perceive up till that point. Cultural space tells us a lot about the nature of a relationship, and here I would like to quote Catherine Sorrell, who has commented, "So if someone comes more into your personal space than you are used to, you can often feel like what's happening there." So, we can also see very easily that as our cultural lenses are different, misconceptions can also easily occur if we are not attentive to the cultural differences in our understanding of proxemics. In our understanding of proximity, the way we arrange our space which is available to us in a formal or an informal setting is also important. Though in our understanding of the space arrangements as a part of our studies of proxemics, the understanding of cultural variation is important, still roughly we can say that the understanding of space is governed by our understanding of 3 basic types. It is true that cultural understanding of space does exist. For example, a very small room which is very barely furnished can sound to be cozy to a person. On the other hand, to a person who is born in an effusive culture, the same room may look rather oppressive and bare. But despite it, we find that the 3 different types of space which researchers have pointed out are the fixed feature space, the semi-fixed feature space and the non-fixed feature space. The semi-fixed feature space is the one in which we find the maximum impact of different types of understanding of proxemics and culture. For example, the socio-fegal and socio-petal understanding of space arrangement is seen maximum in our arrangement of the semi-fixed feature space. The fixed feature space is characterized by those constants which are given to us, those immobile aspects which we normally cannot change, for example, wall, the territorial boundaries, etc. And the fixed feature space is significant in the way we construct office buildings or schools or the shopping malls, the religious places, places of public entertainment, etc. So, the way we perceive the features of our fixed space are internalized at a very early stage in our life. The word which Hall has used for it is the Skinnerian reinforcement procedure. Now, what exactly is this reinforcement procedure which has been suggested by Skinner? B.F. Skinner, a famous behavioral scientist, had put forward this theory of motivation, and he had said that it is on the basis of the punishment and reinforcement that people learn certain behaviors almost in a permanent fashion. an appropriate behavior is awarded, whereas an inappropriate behavior is punished severely. So, it is through this Skinnerian reinforcement procedure to which, as young children, all of us are exposed to, our understanding of the significance of fixed feature space is internalized. The second is the semi-fixed feature space. The semi-fixed feature space is created by an arrangement of those elements which are mobile. For example, the way we arrange curtains, screens, the partitions which we create with the help of furniture, etc., and at the same time the way we use colors. So, these are the boundary markers and they enable us to understand how a system is to be interpreted. If we walk into any room, we get certain impressions on the basis of how furniture, etc., has been arranged in this room. So, simply by looking at the furniture arrangement, we find that we can develop a way in which messages are being communicated to us, whether it is a friendly environment or not, how much severity is there in the office space designing, etc., are immediately clear to us when we look at a particular office space. For example, if you look at this particular photograph which is there on the right hand top corner, we can find that it gives us the interpretation or the impression of being an open and friendly space. In comparison to others, we find that a different office space can also make us feel rather cringy. A non-fixed feature space is informal and dynamic when a person varies the special features of setting or interpersonal dispenses. It is a space which is maintained between interactants without being aware of it. Also, the position someone prefers individually and the things he or she does to appropriate the space around him say something about that person. So, you might have also noticed that when we interact with each other and particularly when we occupy a seating space, we not only occupy the place which is allowed to us by the invisible bubble around us, but at the same time we also want to occupy certain space around us. We want to put certain artifacts there, we want to put certain objects there, and if somebody pushes a file or a cup of tea suddenly across the table towards us, we feel violated. So, we find that whenever there is an unwelcome sound or even a stare or a scent, we find that we are being violated in a space which is sacrosanct to us. So, that is why we find that our understanding of non-fixed feature space is related with our own psyche, and this is also the space which is perhaps the most significant way to impact our work performance in any situation. This is also an understanding of the non-fixed feature space. So, which is a space which is immediately surrounding our body and each of us perceive this space to be our own. Proxemics is also very closely related with the way architectural designs are put across. We have seen it in our discussion of the fixed space also, that a particular architectural design passes on a particular message, and therefore we find that it is also considered as a silent language through which people put across their attitudes, feelings, and even judgments about other people. The latest example of it is the concept of new urbanism, which has started to emphasize the context appropriate architecture. The design of a social space, the interface between social structure, built environment and human behavior, is one of the most challenging concepts of architecture and planning. The ways in which we respond to it are also very interesting to note. For example, researchers have found that German business people visiting the US often look at the open doors in offices and business houses as an indication of a relaxed attitude which is even almost unbusinesslike. They do not like the openness which has been introduced in the architecture. On the other hand, when Americans visit a traditional German office, they find that the closed door are rather secretive. They may even conceal something which is almost conspiratorial. So, you would find that these understandings are developed on the basis of our cultural understanding of how proxemics is to be unfolded in our architectural designs. It is also equally important in the way we look at the space design of the interior. So, social and cultural distances which people maintain are interrelated with interior designs. So, we find that with changing cultural norms, the interior space designs also change. In our offices, we also see that now there is a shift from the individual work culture to a culture of group or teamwork. So, if in the past the office was arranged with a relatively more fixed and individual desks, now with the beginning of the smart office trend, the workstations become more and more flexible, where different teams can be arranged for different works. So, the space is no more fixed and the workstations may also change on the basis of the activities. But a person who has been used to a fixed office space may not feel the same level of work enthusiasm in a non-fixed space. Companies also require suitable offices for sharing activities, but at the same time they have to allow the respect for distances which should exist between people. In the open spaces, therefore, it becomes necessary for us to create areas for acoustic isolation and also for the space which should be known as the individual territory. Our understanding of territory is also pretty much linked with our understanding of the 4 zones of proxemic distance. There is what is known primarily as the body territory, which is the bubble which we carry around us. Then there is a primary territory which obviously belongs to us only, for example, our own home, our car also. Then there is a secondary territory where we develop certain association because we go and do some work over there. It may be our office space, it may be our school, etc. And then lastly, this is the public territory, which is the open space. So, the space also imparts a sense of identity, and if we have a well defined space around us, we find that it also gives us a certain sense of identity, control and permanence. We have referred to the use of markers which some people use around us, and we find that it is a very interesting way to understand how the relationships, the status and power dynamics are displayed around us. You might have also noticed that in closed office spaces also, where a good number of people have to sit and work for long hours, there may be small glass partitions. The glass partitions may be very low in terms of height, but at the same time they are able to designate a particular space which is one's own space. So, it helps us to understand our own territorial rights. In the table setting of restaurants also, you might have also noticed that if it is a table setting for the two, the restaurant owners normally put small objects in the center of the table. They would put small ketchup bottles or maybe salt shakers, etc. in the middle, so that if it is an arrangement for the two, this is your space and this is my space. You might have also noticed that if it is a sitting for where friends are seated, they would be very casually putting this sitting aside so that to communicate that the space which is between them is equally shared. On the other hand, if you are having a cup of tea or spending some time in a restaurant with another person where the table has been set only for 2 people, but you are not very particularly friendly with the other person, you are on a somewhat formal and strict tones, then Try to conduct a very small experiment. Suppose this is a salt shaker or a ketchup bottle. Unconsciously try to put it slightly over the side of the other person so that the space on your side of the table is maximized, right? Within 5 to 10 minutes, you would find that the other person would shift it back to you, towards your side, to increase the space which you have curtailed. Innocuously, you try to push it again, the person would push it back. Irrespective of the fact how comfortable and familiar one is in one's understanding of proximity, you would find that soon it would be a tug of war, people pushing the salt and shakers towards each other's side. So, you would find that it is a display of the power dynamics. It is also a display of the relationship. You would also find that if you are attending a conference for 2 days, people go and occupy a particular seat and keep on occupying the same seat repeatedly in all the sessions. Why? Because they have developed a particular association unconsciously. So, you would find that our understanding of proximity is significant in understanding these aspects of our communication. In seating arrangements also we find that there are linkages between and among proxemic behavior, designing, seating arrangement and power and leadership equations. The centrality of seating position automatically conveys a power play. The most central location in a group physical arrangement allows for greater participation by the members. At the same time, it also provides a certain dominance to a person, and it is also linked with the perception of other people that the leadership of that individual is being perceived. You would find that these aspects of our cultural understanding of proxemics are also carried over to the way space is designed in stage, in theatre and in film. The way people choose the mise en scène and different properties related with it also communicates our cultural understanding of proximity. So, today we have finished our discussion of proxemics. You would find that many aspects which we have discussed in the last 2 modules would be taken over again when we will look at different other aspects of non-verbal communication, because non-verbal communication, any aspect of non-verbal communication cannot be taken in isolation. In our next module, we will look at the oculesics, the language of the eye contact. Thank you.